On the night of their 7th wedding anniversary, Marisol Vance stood in freezing sleet outside the home she had cleaned, maintained, and loved for 7 years, while her husband signed paperwork inside. Not in a lawyer's office. Not behind closed doors. In the front hallway, in full view of the neighbors, beside a woman 10 years younger who was already wearing Marisol's favorite perfume. He didn't even lower his voice. He said she had become an embarrassment. He said the marriage had run its course. He said, and this was the part that would stay lodged beneath her sternum like a shard of broken glass for a very long time, that he had simply outgrown her. Then he handed her a trash bag containing everything she owned that still mattered to him. Nothing. But that same night, a black armored SUV rolled silently through the storm, and the man who stepped out was not the kind of man who offered salvation. He was something far more dangerous than that. Hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay until the end. She will surprise you. The sleet came down in sheets, not falling so much as hurling itself sideways off the Gulf of Mexico and slamming into everything Houston had the audacity to leave standing. It was the kind of cold that didn't just settle into the bones. It infiltrated them, colonized them, made a person feel like her marrow had been swapped out for something wet and gray and useless. The bus stop on the corner of Meridian and 49th offered no shelter worth the name. 3 aluminum walls bolted to a concrete slab. A plastic roof with a crack running down the center that channeled the freezing water into a single precise stream onto whoever was unfortunate enough to stand beneath it. Nobody sane stood beneath it tonight. Marisol Vance stood there anyway. She was 32 years old, 5'4", and she weighed 291 pounds on a good day. She knew that number precisely because Ethan had weighed her every Sunday morning for the last 4 years. His idea of accountability, he'd called it, standing in the bathroom doorway in his running clothes, while she stepped onto the scale in her underwear and tried to breathe through the ritual without letting it show on her face how much it cost her. 291. He'd written it in a notebook. He kept the notebook in his desk drawer. She had never once looked inside it because she already understood that whatever was recorded, there was not for her benefit. The trash bag at her feet held a winter coat, a laptop, 3 changes of clothes, and the framed photograph of her mother that she'd kept on the nightstand since college. Everything else, the forensic accounting textbooks, the case files she'd been building for a consulting project, the good coffee maker she'd bought with her own money, the blue ceramic bowl she'd carried from apartment to apartment since she was 22. All of it was still inside the house behind her, which was no longer her house. Ethan's name had been on the deed. She had not noticed 7 years ago that her name was not. She had noticed a lot of things too late. The sleet hit the aluminum roof above her with a sound like static, constant and featureless, and Marisol stood inside it and did not cry. She had cried twice already tonight, once in the front hallway when Ethan signed the document without looking at her, and once in the driveway when she understood that the locksmith's van parked at the curb meant the locks were already being changed before she'd even finished gathering her things. Both times the tears had surprised her. She was not, by nature, a crier. She was a woman who processed data, who looked for patterns, who built conclusions from evidence rather than impulse. But grief didn't care about methodology. Grief arrived on its own schedule and left on its own terms, and what had hit her in that hallway was something more precise than grief. It was recognition. The understanding that what she had believed to be a life had been, for quite some time, a performance staged entirely for someone else's convenience. She pulled the trash bag closer to her body and tried to remember whether the number 12 bus ran past midnight on a Thursday. She didn't think it did. Her phone had 12% battery. She had not called anyone because there was, she realized now with a clarity that felt almost academic, no one obvious to call. Her mother had died 4 years ago. She had a sister in Phoenix who she spoke to twice a year on birthdays, a relationship that had curdled long before their mother's death and never recovered. Her friends, the ones she'd had before marrying Ethan, had drifted away in the incremental, almost geological way that happened when one person in a marriage systematically made the other feel foolish for maintaining outside relationships. It had not been dramatic. There had been no ultimatums, no obvious cruelty. Ethan had simply made her feel, each time she came home from a dinner with someone, that she'd been slightly embarrassing, that she'd laughed too loudly, revealed too much, taken up too much space. Over years, she had learned to take up less. Over years, the dinners had stopped. She was standing at the freezing dark with 12% battery and nowhere obvious to go. This was the situation. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, without editorializing, without flinching, with the flat precision that had made her genuinely exceptional at her work and genuinely isolated everywhere else. The situation was bad. The situation was not unsurvivable. She needed a hotel room for the night, access to her bank account, which was separate from Ethan's. She had at least managed that. And a plan. She was good at plans. Plans were what she had, instead of several other things that most people took for granted. She was reaching for her phone when the SUV appeared. It came from the north end of Meridian, moving slowly, which was wrong. People didn't move slowly in this weather. People hunched over their steering wheels and ran yellow lights and silently cursed the city's drainage infrastructure. This vehicle moved the way something moved when it wasn't concerned about the weather or the time or anything else the weather and the time implied. It was black, not the ordinary black of a rental car or a fleet vehicle, but the matte, light-absorbing black of something that had been customized specifically to avoid drawing attention and had instead become conspicuous by the quality of its invisibility. The windows were tinted beyond the legal limit. The tires were wide and nearly silent on the wet asphalt. The vehicle was armored, though Marisol did not know that yet. She would learn it later. At this moment, she simply registered that a very large, very expensive vehicle had stopped at the curb 6 feet from where she was standing, in the sleet, at 12:47 in the morning, on what was technically now the anniversary of the worst decision she had ever made. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the rear door opened. The man who stepped out was not what she expected. She had not, in truth, been expecting anything. But the human brain generates predictions constantly, involuntarily, and the prediction her brain generated, large vehicle, late hour, deserted street, was something frightening. What she got instead was a man in his mid-40s, 6 feet and some change, wearing a charcoal overcoat that looked like it had been cut by someone who charged more for that coat than Marisol's monthly grocery budget. He had dark hair, threaded through at the temples with gray that looked not like aging but like emphasis. His face was angular, composed, the kind of face that had learned some time ago to give away only what it intended to give away. He was not a handsome man in any conventional, approachable sense. He was something more unsettling than handsome. He was a man who looked like he understood, completely and without sentiment, exactly how things worked. He stepped around this puddle at the curb's edge with the economy of someone who had long since stopped allowing the physical world to inconvenience him unnecessarily. He did not pull his collar up against the sleet. He seemed almost not to notice it. He looked at her, not the way men had looked at her in the last several years, the dismissive non-look that moved past her toward something more interesting, or the particular brand of appraisal that preceded an unsolicited opinion about her body. He looked at her the way a person looked at something they had been thinking about for a while and were now, finally, examining directly. "Marisol Vance," he said. It wasn't a question. She said nothing. Her brain was running through possibilities. Ex-client, process server, someone Ethan had sent, someone with a grievance she wasn't aware of, and eliminating them as fast as it generated them. None of them fit. None of them explained the specific quality of attention this man was directing at her, which was not hostile and not lecherous and not bureaucratic, and therefore did not belong to any category she had a ready response for. "You're going to lose that finger," he said, nodding toward her left hand, which was clenched around the plastic handle of the trash bag without a glove. She looked down. Her fingers had gone from painful to numb sometime in the last 20 minutes. The index finger of her left hand had turned a color that was not a good color. "I'm fine," she said, because she had been saying that for 7 years, and it came out automatically. "You're not fine." He said it without inflection, without any apparent investment in whether she agreed. Just a statement of observed fact. "You've been standing here for 40 minutes in 31-degree weather without a coat on, and that finger is going to need attention if you stand here another 20. She stared at him. "You've been watching me for 40 minutes. My people have." He held her gaze without any visible discomfort. "Get in the car, Ms. Vance." "Absolutely not. There's heat. There's a first aid kit for your hand. There's coffee if you want it." He paused. "And there's a conversation I've been meaning to have with you for about 6 weeks." She calculated the distance between herself and the SUV, The distance between herself and any other human being currently visible, the battery life remaining on her phone, and the temperature of her hands. She calculated them all simultaneously and without drama, the way she calculated everything. Then she looked at him again. "Who are you?" "Damien Castell." She knew the name. Everyone in Houston who had spent any time at all working in financial forensics knew the name Damien Castell, knew it the way you knew the name of a weather system, as something large, impersonal, and capable of restructuring whatever landscape it moved through. He was connected to industries, investments, and organizations that occupied that particular murky territory between legitimate enterprise and something that the legitimate world preferred not to examine too closely. He had never been indicted. He had been investigated 3 times in the last decade, and each investigation had concluded without charges, the kind of conclusion that meant either that there was nothing to find or that whoever was looking had been given a reason to stop looking. The financial press mentioned him rarely and carefully. His name appeared in documents that other people signed, always at a remove of several corporate layers, always in a context that was technically legal and practically untraceable. She had 6 weeks ago been hired by a mid-sized logistics firm to conduct a routine forensic audit of their accounts receivable. She had, in the process of that audit, found something that was not routine at all. A pattern in the transaction data, small, careful, distributed across dozens of accounts in a way that was clearly designed to evade automated detection, that pointed toward a much larger and more sophisticated financial structure operating beneath the surface of at least 4 apparently unrelated companies. She had flagged it for her client, submitted her report, and moved on to the next job. She had not known, sitting at her laptop in the small apartment she'd shared with Ethan, running queries on 6 months of ledger data, that the structure she'd identified was Damien Castell's. She had not known that finding it would matter to him. She had not known he was the kind of man who noticed things like that. She understood now that she should have known. "You found something in the Verimark accounts," Damien said. He wasn't asking. "I submitted a report to my client," she said carefully. "You did. Your client forwarded it to 3 people before reading it themselves, which is a level of institutional competence I've come to expect from them. 2 of those 3 people work, indirectly, for me." He looked at her without any apparent expectation that this information should be alarming. "The report was impressive, the analysis was accurate, and the methodology you used to identify the pattern is one that my own people had not considered, and, when I asked them to evaluate it retrospectively, could not have replicated." The sleet was hitting the back of her neck now. She had turned at some point to face him more directly, which meant she was no longer sheltered by the aluminum wall. She didn't move back. "What do you want?" "I want the woman who found that pattern working inside my organization rather than outside it." He said it plainly, without sales pitch or elaboration. "I want you in a position where your skills are applied to problems that are actually worth your time, and I want to have that conversation tonight, before someone else makes you an offer based on the report your client is currently circulating to people who do not deserve it." Marisol looked at the trash bag in her hand. She looked at the SUV. She looked at Damien Castell, standing in the sleet in a coat that cost more than her security deposit, watching her with the patient, undramatic attention of a man who was accustomed to waiting for things he had already decided to acquire. "You have terrible timing," she said. "I have precise timing," he said. Get in the car, Ms. Vance." She got in the car. The interior was warm in the deliberate, engineered way of vehicles, built for people who did not accept discomfort as a given. The leather was dark and seamless. There was a partition between the rear compartment and the driver was a large, quiet presence behind it, who had not moved or turned since Marisol settled into the seat. Across from her, Damien sat with the relaxed posture of a man who spent a great deal of time in this vehicle and had long since made peace with it. On the pull-down console between them sat 2 paper cups of coffee, a first aid kit, and a folded wool blanket that Marisol looked at for a moment before picking up and wrapping around her shoulders without commentary. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed until the warmth started returning to her fingers how badly they were shaking. A man in the front passenger seat, not the driver, another man she hadn't registered until now, turned and handed her one of the coffee cups without being asked. He was younger than Damien, broad-shouldered, with a watchful stillness about him that suggested he had been hired specifically for his ability to occupy space without disturbing it. "That's Marcus," Damien said. "He won't bother you." Marcus did not look offended by this description. Marisol wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and tried to remember whether hypothermia caused cognitive impairment before or after the shaking stopped. She was fairly sure it was after. She was fairly sure her cognition was intact. She was also fairly sure that she had just gotten into a car with one of Houston's most connected and least investigated criminal figures, and that she had done so voluntarily, which said something about the state of her evening. "How did you know I'd be at that bus stop?" she said. "We know where Ethan Mercer lives. We know what happened tonight." He picked up his own coffee. "We've been watching you for 6 weeks, as I said." "That's surveillance." "Yes." "That's illegal." He looked at her over the rim of his cup with an expression that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it. "Ms. Vance." "Right." She looked out the window. The Houston skyline was doing what it always did, blazing with indifferent commercial light against the dark. "What exactly are you offering?" "A position within my financial operations. Full salary, significantly above market rate. Complete access to the systems and networks you'll be analyzing. Security, housing, and a level of professional autonomy that your previous employment arrangements did not provide." He said it the way someone recited terms they'd already finalized. "In exchange, I need your expertise, your discretion, and your full professional commitment." Marisol turned back from the window. "You're describing a job." "Yes." "Working for the criminal organization?" "Working for a financial organization with diverse operational interests." He held her gaze. "The line between those two descriptions is, in my experience, largely a matter of perspective and regulatory preference." "That's a very smooth way to say yes. It's an accurate description." He set the coffee cup down. "You've spent 6 years working for clients who used your findings to protect their own interests and paid you a fraction of what that protection was worth. You've spent 7 years in a marriage to a man who used your labor and your competence to build a career he then chose to enjoy without you. I'm offering you something different. I'm offering you a role commensurate with what you're actually capable of." The warmth in the car was beginning to reach her bones. The shaking in her hands was decreasing. She looked at the first aid kit on the console and opened it, finding the chemical hand warmer inside and cracking it without asking permission. She pressed it to the index finger that had worried him. It hurt, coming back. That was how warmth worked with serious cold. It didn't feel like relief first. It felt like the information your body had been suppressing was suddenly allowed back in. "You know what's interesting?" she said, pressing the warmer more firmly against the finger. "You haven't told me a single lie since you opened that car door. I keep waiting for one, and it hasn't come." Something shifted in Damien's expression. It was small, a slight adjustment around the eyes, a fractional release of something he kept compressed. "I find lying inefficient," he said, "in most circumstances." "Most?" "I'm a practical man, Ms. Vance." She looked at him. Car was moving now, she realized. Had been moving for several minutes, pulling through Houston's late-night streets with that same unhurried authority with which Damien seemed to move through everything. She hadn't noticed when it started. "Where are we going?" "My building, 41st floor. There's a guest suite that hasn't been used in 3 months and a kitchen that's stocked." He met her eyes. "You need somewhere to sleep. In the morning, when you've eaten and slept and had a chance to think with a body temperature above 95 degrees, you can tell me whether you want the position or not. If you don't, Marcus will drive you wherever you need to go. And if I do, then we'll discuss terms." She looked out the window again. The sleet had softened slightly, or perhaps the car's insulation was dampening it. The city slid past in streaks of amber and white. She thought about the forensic trail she'd followed 6 weeks ago, the elegance of it, the sheer architectural sophistication of a financial structure built to be invisible, to distribute and redirect and layer until the source was completely obscured. She had found it. She had found it with a methodology that even Damien's own people, apparently, had not thought to use. She had found it and flagged it and submitted it and moved on, because that was what you did with what you found. You documented it and gave it to someone else and went home and made dinner and didn't think about it again because thinking about it again was not your job. And you had a husband who found extended professional preoccupation to be a form of selfishness. She would think about it now. She would think about all of it now. The position, she said slowly. What specifically would I be doing? Forensic analysis of our financial networks. Identifying vulnerabilities before external parties find them. Auditing the accuracy of reports produced by our internal team. He paused. And periodically, analyzing transactions and structures that appear to be operating against our interests without our knowledge. She turned back. You mean someone is stealing from you? He held her gaze. I mean, there are anomalies I cannot account for. And I have a high tolerance for complexity, Ms. Vance, but a very low tolerance for things operating inside my organization that I cannot see. She thought about that for a moment. The chemical warmer was doing its work against her finger. The coffee was good, dark and serious, not the kind of coffee that made concessions. She thought about the nature of anomalies in financial systems. She thought about the specific pleasure of finding the thing that didn't belong, the thread that pulled, the number that broke the pattern. She thought about sitting across a desk from Ethan while he explained, carefully and with the particular gentleness of someone who had rehearsed the conversation, that her income wasn't what he'd hoped it would be at this stage of their lives, as though her income were a shared project he'd been disappointedly monitoring, as though her work were a service she was failing to provide to his satisfaction. 6 weeks, she said. You've been watching me for 6 weeks and you chose tonight. Tonight was when the opportunity presented itself. That's a polite way to describe waiting for my husband to throw me out. I didn't arrange your husband's behavior, Damien said. I anticipated it. There's a difference. She looked at him sharply. What does that mean? For the first time since he'd stepped out of the SUV, Damien Castell paused before answering. It was a short pause, 2, 3 seconds. But it was real, and it told her that what he was about to say was something he'd considered saying and considered not saying, and had now decided to say. Ethan Mercer has a relationship with one of our associate firms, he said. He was promoted to a senior executive position with that firm approximately 8 weeks ago. The promotion was not engineered, but facilitated by people connected to my operations. The warmth in the car suddenly felt less comfortable. Why? Because his position gives certain individuals access to financial structures that they wanted access to. Ethan was convenient, he was ambitious, he was susceptible to flattery, and he was, Damien chose the word with the care of someone selecting a tool for a specific purpose, controllable. The silence in the car was the kind that had weight. You knew about his affair, Marisol said. Her voice was even. It cost her something to keep it even. You knew about tonight. I knew that his personal situation was destabilizing and that the timing of certain events was likely to converge in the near future, yes. And you waited. And I identified a convergence of circumstances that would make a conversation with you possible in a way that it might not have been under other conditions. He met her eyes steadily. I did not cause your marriage to fail, Ms. Vance. I did not engineer your husband's choices. I waited for a moment when you might be willing to hear what I have to say. That is not the same thing as what you're implying. She understood the distinction. She understood it with the part of her brain that was trained to evaluate evidence carefully, to resist the clean narrative, to identify the difference between what the data actually showed and what the emotional response wanted it to show. He was correct, technically. He had not caused this. He had watched it and waited. Whether those two things were as different as he was suggesting was a question she didn't have the bandwidth to resolve tonight. I need to sleep, she said. Yes? In the morning, I'll tell you whether I'm interested. Understood. And if I decide I'm not, Marcus drives me wherever I ask. As I said. She looked out the window for the rest of the ride. The SUV pulled into a private parking structure beneath a tower she recognized. One of the newer developments on the west side, glass and steel, the kind of building that appeared to have no street-level entrance because its residents were not expected to arrive from the street. There was a private elevator. There was a man in the elevator who pressed a button and stepped out without exchanging words with Damien, because apparently Damien's people had learned that unnecessary speech was not something he valued in a professional context. The 41st floor was what money looked like when it had stopped trying to impress anyone. The furniture was minimal and precisely chosen. The windows were floor to ceiling and faced the city's eastern sprawl, and at this hour the view was extraordinary in a bleak way. A grid of light spreading to the horizon, all of it burning regardless of the weather, all of it indifferent to the sleet still streaking the glass. There were no photographs on the walls. There was a painting she couldn't identify, abstract and dark, hanging above a fireplace that appeared to be gas and was not currently lit. The space felt less like a home than like a well-constructed argument for a particular kind of life. Marcus showed her to the guest suite, which had a bathroom with a shower and a closet containing clothing in several sizes. She didn't ask about the clothing. She was past the point of finding things surprising. She showered until the last of the cold was gone. She examined her index finger under the bathroom light. It would bruise, probably, and be tender for a few days, but the warming had been in time. She changed into clothes that fit well enough. She sat on the edge of a bed that was larger than any bed she had slept in since her honeymoon, and she held her phone, which was at 4% now, and she thought about calling her sister. She didn't call her sister. She set the phone on the charger she'd found on the nightstand. Of course there was a charger. Of course it was the right kind. And she lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling and cataloged, in the methodical way she cataloged everything, what she actually knew. She knew that Damien Castell ran a criminal organization, or something adjacent to one, and that he was very good at it, and that she was currently sleeping in his guest suite. She knew that he had approached her because of work she'd done, work she was legitimately proud of, which was not a feeling she was accustomed to sitting with because Ethan had had a way of making professional pride feel like vanity. She knew that somewhere in Damien's financial operations there was an anomaly he couldn't account for. Something moving inside his organization that he couldn't see. And the fact that he couldn't see it meant it was sophisticated. And the fact that it was sophisticated meant it was interesting. And the fact that it was interesting was, she recognized with something between irritation and resignation already a problem for her. Because interesting things were the things she couldn't walk away from, had never been able to walk away from, had spent the better part of her adult life trying to pretend she could walk away from. Because walking away was what a good wife did when her husband found her professional preoccupation inconvenient. She closed her eyes. She was not going to make a decision tonight. Tonight she was going to sleep in a bed that didn't belong to her, in a building that didn't belong to her, wearing clothes that had been left for an unknown person in an unknown size. And she was going to let her nervous system decompress from the last 6 hours of her life without requiring it to simultaneously process a major career decision. She was 32 years old, and she was starting over from a bus stop in the sleet, and she was, underneath the exhaustion and the bruised finger and the particular humiliation of being assessed by one's husband and found insufficient, she was, underneath all of it, still herself. She still knew how to find the thing that didn't belong. She still knew how to pull the thread. Whatever was stealing from Damien Castell, it didn't know she was coming. She slept. In the morning, Damien was at the kitchen island when she walked in, dressed in different clothes than the night before, reading something on a tablet that he set down when he heard her. There was coffee. There were eggs, already made, warming on the stove. Not made by him, she suspected, but by someone who had come and gone without announcing themselves. She poured coffee and sat across from him. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "I want to see the anomaly," she said. "Whatever's moving through your books that you can't account for, I want to see it. If I can find it, we talk terms. If I can't—" She picked up her coffee. "I'll know it's not worth my time, and we'll end the conversation there." Something moved through Damien's expression. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. The expression of a man who had predicted an outcome and was now watching it arrive on schedule. "There's an office on the 39th floor," he said. "I'll have Marcus bring you the access credentials after breakfast." She nodded and ate her eggs. They were good eggs. She noticed things like that. It was 3 days later, at 11:47 at night, sitting in the 39th floor office, surrounded by 6 weeks of transaction data spread across 4 monitors, that Marisol found the thread. It was small. It was deliberately, beautifully small. A series of microtransactions distributed across 17 subsidiary accounts in a pattern that, if you approached the data the way a conventional auditor approached data, was completely invisible. If you looked at each account individually, everything balanced. If you looked at the aggregate flow across all 17, everything balanced. If you ran the standard deviation analysis on transaction timing, everything fell within acceptable variance ranges. The pattern was designed to defeat exactly the kind of analysis that Damien's internal team had been running, which meant whoever had designed it knew what Damien's internal team would do, which meant it was an inside job, which meant she sat back in the chair. She looked at the screen. She ran the correlation one more time, just to be certain, because certainty was what this required and what the evidence was now providing with uncomfortable clarity. Then she picked up the phone that Marcus had given her, a secure line, he'd said, as though she were a person who routinely needed secure lines, which she was now apparently becoming, and she called the number at the top of the contact list. Damien picked up on the second ring. "I found it," she said. A pause. "How long?" 3 days. Your internal team has been running the wrong analysis. The pattern is in the timing distribution across 17 subsidiary accounts. Whoever designed it knew your detection methodology. Another pause, longer this time. When Damien spoke again, his voice had changed. Not dramatically. He was not a man who did anything dramatically. But something in the register had shifted, a compression of something cold and deliberate. "Can you determine origin? Who's moving it?" She looked at the screen. She had the origin. She had traced it back through 4 layers of corporate structure to a name she recognized. Not because it was a famous name, not because she'd seen it in the financial press, but because it was a name that appeared on documents she had personal, specific, and very non-professional reasons to know. She stared at it for a long moment. "Yes," she said slowly. "I can determine origin." "And?" She took a breath. "I need you to come down to the office," she said, "because what I'm looking at changes the conversation we're about to have." The line was quiet for a moment. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Damien said. And before she could prepare herself for what came next was already beginning. Damien arrived in 9 minutes, not 10. Marisol heard the elevator before she heard him. The soft mechanical exhale of the doors, then footsteps in the corridor that were unhurried but purposeful. The walk of a man who had been called somewhere important and was choosing deliberately not to run. She used those 9 minutes to print 3 pages of documentation and arrange them on the desk in the order she intended to present them, because the order mattered. The order was the argument. She had learned that early in her career. The sequence in which you presented evidence determined whether the person receiving it understood it as a conclusion or merely as data. She needed Damien to understand this as a conclusion. He came through the office door and looked at her first, then at the monitors, then at the printed pages on the desk. He was wearing a dark shirt, no jacket, which told her he had come directly from wherever he slept in this building without stopping to reconstruct the full version of himself that the world usually received. He looked sharper this way, somehow, less assembled. She noticed it and filed it without comment. "Show me," he said. She turned back to the monitors. The pattern runs across 17 subsidiary accounts. On the surface, every account balances independently. Standard variance analysis shows nothing. Your team was looking for deviation within individual accounts, which is the correct methodology for embezzlement in most organizational structures. She pulled up the first display. But this isn't standard embezzlement. This is architectural. Whoever designed it wasn't stealing money from a single point. They were bleeding it from 17 points simultaneously in amounts calibrated specifically to stay beneath your detection threshold at every level. Damien was standing beside her now, close enough that she was aware of the warmth coming off him. He was looking at the screen with the stillness of someone whose entire attention had narrowed to a single point. Each withdrawal is small, she continued. Individually, meaningless. But the pattern of timing, the intervals between transactions, the rotation of which accounts are active on which days, that's not random. That's a clock. Someone built a clock inside your financial system, and it's been running for, she pulled up the timeline, 22 months. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 22 months, Damien repeated. His voice was exactly level. At a minimum. I can only trace it through the records I've been given access to. The actual start date could be earlier. He moved to the chair across from her and sat down. He did not look at the pages she'd printed. He looked at her. How much? Conservatively, across the period I can document, approximately 4.3 million. She paused. I think the real number is closer to 6. Damien's jaw tightened. It was a small movement. It was the first time she had seen his face do anything involuntary. Origin. She picked up the first printed page and placed it in front of him. He looked at it. He read the name at the top. He looked up at her. Victor Kane, he said. Yes, Victor Kane. His name sat in the room the way a stone sat in still water, everything around it immediately rearranged. Marisol watched Damien's face go through something she couldn't fully read but could partially interpret. Not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated than surprise. The expression of a man who had held a suspicion at arm's length for a long time and was now watching it confirmed with the specific, cold dissatisfaction of being right about something he had not wanted to be right about. You're certain, Damien said. The corporate structure traces through 3 shell entities before it reaches a holding company registered in Delaware 8 months before the withdrawals begin. The holding company has 1 authorized signatory. She tapped the page. Victor Kane. The registration documents are on the second page. Damien did not look at the second page. He was still looking at her. Kane has been with my organization for 11 years. I know. He built the subsidiary network you just traced through. I know. That's how he knew exactly where the thresholds were. She kept her voice even. He built the system. He knew precisely how your team monitored it. He designed the theft to exploit the specific blind spots he'd created. Something moved across Damien's face then. Not anger, or not only anger. Something that looked like the particular exhaustion of a man who had trusted something completely and was now in the process of understanding what that trust had cost him. He breathed out slowly through his nose. She watched him do it. She watched him take the feeling, whatever it was, loyalty curdled into something acidic, the weight of 11 years recontextualized in 4 minutes, and compress it. Not eliminate it. Compress it, the way you compress something you intended to use later. There's a third page, Marisol said. He looked at her. She placed it in front of him. He looked down. Marisol watched him read it. She watched his eyes move across the document and stop. She watched him read the relevant section a second time, and then a third, because even Damien Castell apparently needed 3 passes to fully process a thing that shouldn't have been there. Ethan Mercer, he said. Yes, the name was different in Damien's mouth than Victor Kane's had been. Victor Kane was a betrayal. Ethan Mercer was a complication, and they both knew it, and the fact that they both knew it made the silence that followed the name more loaded than either of them was entirely prepared for. He's a front, Marisol said. Her voice was controlled. She was working hard to keep it controlled. Kane needed a clean executive identity attached to the legitimate side of the structure. Someone with corporate credibility, no prior connection to your operations, visible enough to provide cover, but not sophisticated enough to recognize what they were covering. Ethan was promoted to Senior Vice President of Ardent Capital 8 weeks ago. She had to stop for 1 second, just one. Ardent Capital is one of the 3 shell entities in Kane's structure. Ethan doesn't know that. Based on the transaction records, he's never had access to the accounts in question. He's signing off on reports that have been curated specifically to show him what Kane wants him to see. Damien was watching her face, not the documents. Her face. You're certain he doesn't know, he said. No, I'm not certain of anything yet. I'm telling you what the data currently shows, which is that his signatures appear on legitimate operational documents and not on the accounts Kane is running. That could mean he's clean. It could mean he's careful. She held Damien's gaze. I need more access to make that determination. The office was very quiet. The building's ventilation system was a low, constant hum beneath everything. Through the windows, Houston was doing its usual indifferent burn. Towers lit for no one in particular. The freeway interchange to the south carrying its 3 a.m. traffic of trucks and insomniacs and people coming off late shifts. This is a problem for you, Damien said. Not as a question, not as sympathy. As an observation, stated plainly, the way he stated most things. Everything is a problem for me right now, Marisol said. That's not new information. I mean specifically. He leaned forward slightly. Your husband, former husband, is materially connected to the man who has been stealing from my organization. That's not a neutral position for you to be in. There are people in my organization who will draw conclusions from that connection. She felt the implications settle. You mean they'll wonder if I'm clean? I mean, some of them will not wonder. Some of them will decide. She looked at him directly. Are you one of them? A pause. Shorter than the ones that had preceded it. No. But my confidence in you doesn't change the operational reality. You found this. You brought it to me. That's not what someone does if they're protecting the network. He glanced at the documents. But you should understand what you've walked into. I understand what I've walked into. I don't think you do yet. He picked up the third page. Victor Kane is not a man who responds to exposure with resignation. He has resources, relationships, and 11 years of accumulated knowledge about how this organization operates. When he discovers that someone has traced his structure, Damien set the page down. The response will not be passive. Marisol's stomach did something unpleasant. She managed not to let it show. When he discovers, not if, when. These things always surface. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand that bringing this to me tonight changes your situation significantly. You were a new hire in a guest suite 3 days ago. As of this conversation, you're the person who found something that 11 years of internal review did not. That changes what you are to me. It also changes what you are to Victor. The way he said it made the hair on the back of her neck do something she didn't like. How many people know I'm here, she said, in this building, working for you? 4. Myself, Marcus, my operations director, and the woman who manages the residential floors. He held her gaze. Victor Kane is not among them. How long before he finds out? That depends on how quickly we move. He stood. The movement was unhurried, but it carried decision in it. I'm going to need you to document everything you found tonight. Complete audit trail, source files, the full analytical methodology, in a format that can be presented as evidence if necessary. Evidence to who? That depends on what we decide to do with it. He looked at her in a way that was careful. What do you want to do with it, Ms. Vance? She understood what he was really asking. It wasn't a practical question. He had people who could handle the practical decisions without her input. He was asking whether she needed to be removed from the operational choices because of her personal connection to one of the names on the document in front of them. She thought about Ethan. She thought about him with the specific detachment of someone who has recently been required to update their assessment of another person from the ground up. She thought about 8 weeks ago, the night he'd come home elated about the Ardent Capital promotion, how he'd opened a good bottle of wine and told her that this was what the last several years had been building toward, as though the last several years had been a shared project and not a sustained exercise in one person diminishing another. She thought about how she'd congratulated him. She thought about the specific shape of the relief on his face, which she had read, at the time, as happiness, and which she now understood was the relief of a man who had confirmed that the thing he was planning was still on schedule. She didn't know if Ethan was clean. She genuinely did not know. And that unknowing was a different kind of pain than the pain of the bus stop, more precise and more destabilizing, because the bus stop had been a thing that happened to her, and this was a thing she now had to understand. I want to know the truth, she said, about Ethan. Whether he's involved or not. I want the actual answer, not the answer that's convenient for anyone. She held Damien's gaze. And then I want to be in the room when you decide what to do about Victor Kane. Damien looked at her for a long moment. The office hummed. The city burned outside the windows. All right, he said. He left. She turned back to the monitors and started building the documentation he'd asked for. Her hands were steady. She made them steady. She worked for 4 hours straight without stopping, and when she finally pushed back from the desk and looked at what she'd produced, she felt the particular cold satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Evidence organized, argument constructed, every source cited, and every inference labeled as inference rather than fact, because intellectual honesty was the thing she would not sacrifice regardless of what else was in motion. She went upstairs to the guest suite at 6:43 in the morning and slept for 3 hours. She woke to Marcus knocking on the door. Mr. Castell wants you in the conference room, Marcus said through the door. 30 minutes. She was there in 20. The conference room on the 41st floor had the same floor-to-ceiling windows as the rest of the building, but it also had a long table, 8 chairs, and 4 people in those chairs who were not Damien. Damien stood at the head of the table. He was fully assembled this time, the jacket, the controlled expression, the quality of presence that occupied a room differently than other people occupied rooms. He introduced the 4 people efficiently and without elaboration. His operations director, a woman named Carla, who was somewhere in her 50s, and had the contained energy of a person who had been in high-stress environments for so long that stress had become invisible to her. A lawyer whose name Marisol immediately noted and would later look up. A man named Torres who was in charge of something Damien described as external relations, and who Marisol understood within 30 seconds of looking at him did not mean public relations. And Marcus, who apparently served multiple functions. None of them looked at her with warmth. Carla looked at her with the careful neutrality of professional assessment. Torres looked at her with something closer to suspicion that he wasn't bothering to disguise. Marcus looked at the wall.
Ms.
Vance identified the source of the capital irregularities last night, Damien said. He did not frame it as an achievement or a revelation. He stated it as fact, the way the next item in a sequence was stated. The full documentation is being distributed to you now. A tablet in front of each person lit up. I'd like each of you to review it before we discuss next steps. You have 10 minutes. The 10 minutes were quiet except for the sound of people reading. Marisol sat at the far end of the table from Damien and drank the coffee that had been placed in front of her seat and watched the faces of 4 strangers process information that had taken her 3 days and most of her professional capability to produce. She watched Carla's expression go through several things in quick succession and then flatten out. She watched Torres stop reading at the 3rd page and look up at Damien, and Damien looked back at him with an expression that said, "Yes, that's the name you think it is, and no, we are not going to address that with the reaction you are currently suppressing." Torres looked back down and kept reading. When the 10 minutes were up, Damien said, "Questions." Torres put his tablet down. "How confident are we in the source?" He said it to Damien. He did not look at Marisol. "Extremely," Damien said. "The methodology is documented in the appendix. You're welcome to have it independently verified." "I'd like it independently verified." "That's reasonable. I've already arranged it." Damien held Torres's gaze for a moment that was about 3 seconds longer than a neutral exchange required. "Any other questions?" "Victor's been in the building 3 times this week," Carla said. Not loudly, just into the table, in the tone of someone who had been holding a piece of information and had now decided to put it down. "Monday, Wednesday, yesterday. Meeting with the operations team on the 37th floor." The room processed that. "What was the stated purpose?" Damien said. "Q3 review preparation." Carla's hands were flat on the table. "I signed off on the meeting requests. I had no reason not to." "You had no reason not to," Damien said. "That's not a criticism." Marisol was watching Carla. The woman's face was doing something restrained, not guilt exactly. The expression of someone who was recalculating what a series of ordinary events had actually been. "If Kane has been in the building this week," Marisol said, and felt the table's attention shift to her the way a physical pressure shifted, "then he may have already sensed something. Not necessarily from me. I've been on 39, isolated, and Marcus has managed access. But if he's sensitive to the organization's rhythms, 3 visits in 1 week during a period when something in the network is being examined." She stopped. "Does he have contacts on 39? Silence. "There's an analyst on 39, Torres said slowly. "Name of Briggs. Kane hired him 4 years ago." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the ones before it. Damien turned to Marcus. Something passed between them that was not verbal and did not need to be. "Find out when Briggs last spoke to Kane," Damien said, "and what the content of that conversation was." Marcus left the room. Marisol looked at Damien. Damien was looking at the door Marcus had closed behind him. His face was the composed, controlled face she had come to expect from him, but beneath it, in the set of his shoulders and the particular way his right hand had come to rest on the table, flat, still, pressing down very slightly on the surface, she read something that her previous professional experience had not prepared her to read in a person, but that 7 years of living with a controlled, deliberate man had taught her to recognize. He was angry, not the loud kind, the cold, architectural kind that didn't announce itself and didn't diminish and didn't forgive. "Ms. Vance," he said, without looking at her, "I'd like you to go back to 39 and pull every interaction Briggs has had with the Victor Kane accounts over the last 90 days. I'll need expanded access. You have it as of now." She stood. She was almost to the door when Torres said, behind her, "Mr. Castell." The Mercer connection. He paused. I want to be on record that I think the optics of that require careful handling. She stopped walking. She did not turn around. Noted, Damien said. His voice was completely even. Miss Vance, you can go. She went. In the elevator, she stood with her back against the rear wall and breathed carefully through her nose. Torres hadn't said anything that wasn't professionally reasonable. He had said it in a way that was designed to be heard by her, which was a choice, and not a friendly one, but it was professionally reasonable. The optics of that require careful handling. She was the ex-wife of a man connected to the theft. She was new. She was, from Torres's perspective, an unknown variable in an equation that was already producing alarming results. His suspicion was logical. She could not afford to find it personal. She found it personal. She breathed through it. The elevator reached 39. She stepped out and walked to the office and sat down in front of the monitors and pulled up the access panel and typed in the expanded credentials Damien had apparently transmitted to the system in the 30 seconds between her leaving the conference room and her reaching the elevator. She looked at Briggs's activity logs. She looked at 90 days of access records, file openings, data exports, query histories. She found the first data transfer in 11 minutes. It was small, like everything else in this story was small. A compressed file, 9 kilobytes, sent from Briggs's workstation to an external drive that had been briefly connected to the system 43 days ago. 9 kilobytes was nothing. 9 kilobytes was a thumbnail image, a short audio file, 3 pages of text. 9 kilobytes was also, potentially, a list of 17 account numbers and the transaction timing pattern that governed them. She sat back. She thought about Victor Kane, who had been in this building 3 times this week. She thought about Briggs, 1 floor below the conference room where Damien's team had just spent an hour discussing the evidence she'd assembled. She thought about the 43 days between that data transfer and this moment, and what could have been done in 43 days with the right 9 kilobytes. She picked up the secure phone. He knows, she said when Damien answered, or he knew enough 43 days ago to begin preparing. Briggs transferred data to an external drive. I need to know what was on it. A pause. When Damien spoke, his voice had that compressed quality again, cold and deliberate and not raising itself for anyone. Can you determine what was transferred? I can reconstruct the file type and approximate content based on the access logs that preceded the transfer. Give me 2 hours. You have one? She worked in 53 minutes. What she found was worse than a list of account numbers. The file Briggs had transferred contained query records, specifically the search queries that Damien's internal audit team had been running against the subsidiary network in the 6 weeks before Marisol arrived. Not the accounts themselves. The questions. The exact analytical questions the team had been asking of the data, which meant that Victor Kane had known, for 43 days, not just that someone was looking, but exactly how they were looking, which angles they were approaching from, which questions they were asking, which meant he'd had 43 days to move things. She called Damien back. He's been moving assets, she said, and her voice came out more controlled than she felt. He's known someone was looking for 43 days and he's been repositioning. I need to know if there's a version of this financial structure I haven't seen yet. Accounts that weren't in the records you gave me. The pause on Damien's end was the longest one yet. There may be, he said finally. Then I need access to them. Another pause. Those records are not in the standard system. She understood what that meant. Where are they? I'll bring them to you. When? Tonight. A breath, almost too quiet to hear. Ms. Vance, I need you to understand something before tonight. She waited. What you may find in those records will expand the scope of this significantly. Beyond Victor. Beyond the accounting structure. He stopped. I need to know, before I give you access to that material, that you are prepared for the possibility that the name connected to it is not one you've seen yet. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Whose name? She said. But she already knew, from the specific quality of Damien's silence, that he wasn't going to answer that on the phone. And she already knew, from the specific quality of her own dread settling into her chest like something that intended to stay there, that whatever name was in those records was going to require her to make a choice she had no framework yet for making, and that once she made it, Damien arrived at 39 at 9:14 in the evening, carrying nothing. No tablet, No printed documents, no briefcase, just himself, in the dark shirt again, the assembled version of him slightly less assembled than usual, the top button of the shirt open, which Marisol had not seen before. He closed the office door behind him and stood for a moment looking at her across the width of the room, and she understood from that look, and from the nothing in his hands, that whatever he was about to tell her was not something he had committed to paper. "Sit down," he said. "I'm already sitting." "Good." He came to the chair across from her and sat down himself, which was also new. Usually he stood. The sitting changed the geometry of the conversation in a way she couldn't immediately quantify, but could feel. It meant they were at the same level. It meant he had decided that what was about to happen required that. She waited. 7 years ago, Damien said, before you married Ethan Mercer, he was employed by a financial services firm called Grayline Associates. You know this. I know this. What you don't know is that Grayline Associates was, at that time, a legitimate front for a capital movement operation I was running through 3 intermediary banks. Grayline didn't know that. Most of their staff didn't know that. They were a real company doing real work that also, incidentally, processed transactions. I needed processed without direct connection to my name. Marisol's hands were flat on the desk. She kept them flat. Ethan worked at Grayline for 2 years before we met. Yes, he was a mid-level analyst. He had no knowledge of the underlying structure. He was, genuinely, just an employee. Damien's voice was even and careful, the voice of someone navigating a path they had mapped in advance. But his employment record, his signature on certain internal documents, his presence in that building during a specific 18-month period, all of that created a data trail. A trail that, in the wrong hands, could be assembled into a picture that was not accurate but was convincing. The ventilation system hummed. Outside, the city burned. "Victor," Marisol said. "Victor has had access to the Grayline records for 11 years. He helped me build the Grayline structure. He knows what's in those files and he knows how to use them." Damien held her gaze. 8 weeks ago, when I asked him, directly in this building, whether he had any knowledge of the capital irregularities, he told me no. He looked me in the eye and he told me no, and 2 days later he arranged Ethan Mercer's promotion to Ardent Capital. Marisol's brain was doing what it did, running the logic, building the structure, following each line to its end. She followed this one and felt it land in her chest like a fist. "He set Ethan up," she said, "not just as a front, as a contingency. If the theft was ever traced, Ardent Capital leads to Ethan. Ethan's employment history leads to Grayline. Grayline leads to documents with Ethan's signature that, read without context, suggest a prior relationship with my financial operations." Damien's jaw was tight. "Victor built himself an exit, and the exit goes through your husband. Ex-husband. Ex-husband." She stood up. She didn't mean to. It was the body's decision, made before the mind caught up. The physical need to not be sitting down while this particular architecture assembled itself in her head. She walked to the window. Houston was out there doing its thing, indifferent and enormous. All that light and movement that cared nothing about whatever was being dismantled in a glass office on the 39th floor. "The name," she said, with her back to him. "The name you said was in those records. The one that isn't Victor." Silence. "Tell me." "Marisol." She turned around. He had used her first name precisely twice since she'd known him, and both times had meant the same thing, that what followed was not going to be something she could process with methodology alone. "Whose name?" she said. He reached into his shirt pocket. She hadn't noticed the slight weight there until now, and placed a single folded page on the desk. He didn't push it toward her. He just placed it there and let it be a thing she could choose to pick up. She walked back to the desk. She picked up the page. She unfolded it. It was a transaction record. A single transaction, dated 19 months ago, from a holding account she hadn't seen in any of the records she'd been given access to. The originating account number was formatted differently from the accounts in Victor's network. Different bank, different structure, different country of registration. But the destination account she recognized. It was one of the 17 subsidiary accounts in Victor's system, the one she'd spent 3 days tracing. The authorized signatory on the originating account was not Victor Kane. It was not Ethan Mercer. It was a name she recognized from a different context entirely. A name she had seen on a corporate filing 3 weeks into her forensic work that she had flagged as a minor irregularity and then set aside because it had appeared to be a clerical error in an otherwise clean document. She had set it aside. She had moved on. The name was Carla Reyes, Damien's operations director. The woman who had been in the conference room this morning with her hands flat on the table, telling them that Victor Kane had been in the building 3 times this week. The woman who had said, in the tone of someone delivering neutral information, "I signed off on the meeting requests. I had no reason not to." Marisol looked at the page for a long time. "How long have you known?" she said. "I found this record 2 days before you arrived in this building." His voice was unchanged. "That was the worst part. I had it verified by someone outside the organization before I brought you in. You brought me in knowing your operations director was connected to the theft. I brought you in to determine the full scope of what I was looking at. I had one data point. I needed someone to find the rest. You used me to build a case against your own people. I used your skills to map a situation I could not safely map using anyone already inside it." He held her gaze without flinching. "Because anyone already inside it was potentially compromised, including the people I've trusted for a decade." Marisol set the page down. Her hands were not shaking. She was past shaking. She was in the territory beyond shaking, which was a kind of hyper-clarity. Every object in the room precise and slightly unreal, every sound distinct, the kind of sensory sharpening that happened when the body understood that the situation had become something that required full resources. "Carla knows I'm here," Marisol said. "She was in the conference room this morning. She heard everything." "Yes." "She knows what I found." "Yes." "And you told me this at 9 o'clock at night instead of this morning because I needed to know this morning how she responded to the information, what she did with it, who she contacted after the meeting." He paused. "She contacted Victor Kane at 11:47 this morning. A call of 4 minutes and 30 seconds from a personal device to a number that routes through 2 VoIP relays before reaching a cell phone registered in a different name." The room felt very small suddenly. Not physically. The room was the same size it had always been. But something had contracted. The available space for the version of this situation that was manageable had just gotten significantly smaller. "She told him what I found," Marisol said. "She told him enough. Which means Kane knows I'm the one who found it." Damien said nothing, which was the same as yes. Marisol breathed. Once, carefully, through her nose. "How dangerous is that?" Victor Kane has spent 11 years building relationships that extend well beyond this organization. He has people in positions I cannot immediately counteract, and he is now aware that a forensic accountant who walked in off the street 3 days ago has dismantled 22 months of carefully constructed architecture. Damien's voice was level and precise and completely without comfort. "So, yes, it's dangerous." "What does he want?" "Primarily, he wants the evidence destroyed and the investigation stopped. Secondarily, he wants a credible alternative narrative established, one that points the accountability somewhere other than at him." A pause. "Your ex-husband's employment history at Greyline is a very convenient somewhere." The word destroyed sat in the air. She turned it over. "He'd try to frame Ethan," she said. "Right. He'd do more than try. He has the documentation to make it credible. Ethan's signatures, the Greyline connection, the Ardent Capital promotion that Kane himself arranged. Assembled correctly, it's a convincing case against a man who has no idea any of this exists. Ethan is an idiot, but he's not a thief." "Correct. And irrelevant, if the evidence against him is well constructed enough." She sat back down. Not because she was calm, she was nowhere near calm, but because standing up required a baseline of physical steadiness she was not currently able to guarantee. She pressed her palms flat on the desk and looked at the monitors and the documentation she'd spent the last 3 days building with something that felt very much like watching a structure she'd constructed get quietly surrounded on all sides. "What about Carla?" she said. "Carla made a choice this morning. She'll be managed accordingly." "Managed accordingly." She repeated it without inflection. "What does that mean?" "It means she won't be a variable in this equation going forward." Marisol looked at him. "I don't kill people, Ms. Vance." His voice was flat. but I remove them from positions where they can do damage. Carla will find, in the very near future, that her access to this organization's systems and personnel has been completely revoked. She'll also find that certain information about her own financial history has been requested by the appropriate regulatory bodies. A pause. She knew the risks of her choices. She made them anyway. And Victor. Victor is a more complex situation. He leaned forward. Victor has leverage I cannot neutralize quickly. He has relationships with people whose cooperation I need, and moving against him directly right now, without the full evidentiary picture assembled and verified, creates operational exposure I'm not prepared to accept. She understood. You need the complete case first. I need everything documented, sourced, verified, and in a format that leaves no analytical gaps. And I need it before Victor has time to move the assets he's been repositioning for 43 days into a structure I can't follow. He held her eyes. Which means I need you to finish what you started, faster than we anticipated. How much faster? 48 hours. She almost laughed. She didn't. 48 hours to reconstruct and document a 22-month financial scheme across an unknown number of accounts, with incomplete record access, while the primary subject knows I'm looking. Yes, that's not a reasonable timeline. No, he said, it's not. I'm aware of that. He looked at her steadily. I'm also aware that you came into this building 3 days ago with nothing, and in 72 hours you found something 11 years of internal review missed. So I'm going to ask you to do an unreasonable thing in an unreasonable time frame, and I'm going to give you everything I have to help you do it. She looked at the monitors. She looked at the transaction page with Carla's name on it. She thought about 43 days of asset repositioning and what that looked like in practice. The money moving through structures she hadn't seen yet, being layered and redistributed, being made to disappear into legitimate-looking vehicles that would take months to unravel through conventional channels. She thought about Ethan, who was somewhere in the city tonight, probably in the apartment he'd moved his girlfriend into, completely unaware that someone had built a financial crime around his name and his employment history and his absolute clueless ambition. She thought about something else, too. Something she'd been not thinking about for the last 20 minutes because there hadn't been space for it, but which was now forcing itself into the available space with the insistence of things that were important enough. After this, she said, when it's documented, when Victor is handled, what happens to the evidence about Ethan? Damien looked at her. His gray line employment, his signatures, the narrative Kane built around him. She kept her voice even. It cost her. What happens to it? That depends on what the full documentation shows. And if it shows he's clean, that he's genuinely just a pawn, then the evidence that could be used against him is, for practical purposes, part of an evidentiary package that will be used against Victor Kane instead. He paused. It won't be actionable against Ethan. I need that to be explicit. It will be explicit. His voice was quiet. I understand what you're asking. She nodded once. She turned back to the monitors. Go away, she said. I need to work. He went. She worked. She worked through the night and into the morning with a focus that was the sharpest thing she had ever pointed at a problem in her professional life, because the problem had become personal in the specific way that made focus either impossible or absolute. And for Marisol Vance, it had always been the latter. She pulled financial records. She cross-referenced account structures. She rebuilt the transaction timeline from the outside in, working backwards from the assets that had moved in the last 43 days, tracing them to their sources, mapping the repositioning pattern that Victor had been executing since Briggs's data transfer had told him someone was closing in. It was, even now, even under these conditions, a beautiful structure. She recognized that. The way a person recognized the craft in something that was being used against them. Victor Kane had spent 11 years building a machine that stole money in amounts too small to notice from places too numerous to track, and he had done it with genuine architectural intelligence, and she hated that she could appreciate it at the same time that she was systematically taking it apart. At 4:17 in the morning, she found the account she hadn't known to look for. It was registered in the Cayman Islands, buried inside a corporate structure that connected to Ardent Capital through a chain of 4 holding companies. The account had been opened 26 months ago. 4 months before the first withdrawals from the subsidiary network. It was, she understood immediately, the collection point. The place where everything Victor had been bleeding out of Damien's organization was being aggregated before it was distributed further. It was the heart of the machine, and the account had 2 authorized signatories, Victor Kane, and a second name. A name she had not expected, a name that made her sit back in her chair and press both hands over her mouth and stare at the screen for a long moment, while her brain ran the implications and kept running them, and kept arriving at the same conclusion, no matter which direction she approached from. The second name was Damien Castell. She sat very still. Her first thought was methodological. Verify. Don't react. Verify. She pulled the registration documents. She pulled the signature records. She ran the digital authentication on the signature file, comparing it against Damien's signatures in the documents she'd been given access to over the last 3 days. The access credentials, the internal memos, the authorization records she'd used as reference points throughout her analysis. The signatures matched. She pulled them again. She ran the comparison a second time with different reference samples. The signatures matched. She sat in the office at 4:23 in the morning with documentation on her screen that said Damien Castell had co-signed the account that Victor Kane had been using to steal from Damien Castell's organization, and she tried to construct an innocent explanation for that and could not construct one that held. Either Damien had set up a theft from his own organization, for reasons she could not immediately fathom, but which existed, in the operational logic of criminal finance, as a legitimate category of action, or someone had forged his signature on the registration documents with enough sophistication to pass digital authentication. Or Damien had known about this account from the beginning, had known about Victor's operation from the beginning, had brought her in not to stop it, but to document it in a way that could be used for a purpose she had not yet identified. She thought about the specific things he had said to her, the precise framing, not, "I need you to find who's stealing from me, but I need someone who can map a situation I could not safely map using anyone inside it." She thought about the way he had given her information in sequence, controlled sequence, each piece arriving when he decided it should arrive. She thought about the account records she hadn't been given access to initially, the records that required a specific request, a specific conversation, a specific moment of apparent trust before they were handed over. She thought about being at a bus stop in the sleet. She thought about a black armored SUV moving slowly through the storm. She thought about a man who said, "I have precise timing." Her hands came down from her face. She looked at the screen. She looked at the signatures. She looked at the account number and the registration date and the 26 months of deposits that had been flowing through it. And she made herself think, not feel, think, about what a person in her position was supposed to do with this information. She could call Damien. She could put the documentation in front of him and watch his face and try to read whether what she saw there was genuine shock or the performance of it. She could say nothing. She could finish the documentation he'd asked for and leave his own signature out of it and see what happened next, see whether the version of events he was constructing required her to be ignorant of this specific piece. She could walk out of the building right now with everything she'd built saved to the encrypted drive she'd been maintaining since day one, because she was a forensic accountant and maintaining an independent record of her own work was the professional reflex she'd never once suppressed, regardless of who she was working for. She looked at the encrypted drive sitting beside the keyboard. She looked at the account registration with Damien's signature. She looked at the door. And then her secure phone lit up on the desk beside her, and the screen showed a single message from a number she didn't recognize. And the message said 4 words that made the available air in the room feel suddenly completely insufficient. "We need to talk now." Below the message, after a pause of 3 seconds, a second line appeared. It was Victor Kane. And before Marisol could process what it meant that Victor Kane had her secure number, the number Marcus had given her, the number that was supposed to route through layers that made it untraceable. The phone rang. Not a message this time. A call, from the same unregistered number, the screen lighting up in the dark office with that particular urgency that a ringing phone carried at 4:23 in the morning when you were sitting alone with evidence that had just rewritten everything you thought you understood about the situation you were in. Marisol looked at it ring. She picked up. She said nothing. "Good," said Victor Kane. "You're smart enough not to announce yourself. That's encouraging." His voice was not what she'd expected. She had built a picture of Victor Kane from documents and transaction records and the specific quality of Damien's anger when his name was said, and the picture she'd built had a particular sound to it, cold, contained, the voice of a man who operated from behind layers. The voice on the phone was warmer than that, almost conversational, the voice of someone who was genuinely comfortable with the moment he was in, which was the most alarming thing about it. "How do you have this number?" she said. "Marcus Reyes is Carla's nephew." A pause, just long enough to let that land. "Did Damien mention that when he assigned Marcus to manage your access?" She said nothing. Her hand on the phone was steady. She made it steady. "I'll take that as a no." Kane's voice carried something that wasn't quite amusement. "Ms. Vance, I know what you found tonight. I know which account you're looking at, and I know that you're currently sitting in that office trying to decide what finding Damien's signature on that registration document actually means." He paused again. "I'd like to offer you a more accurate interpretation than the one Damien will give you when he arrives. Damien doesn't know I found it yet. He will in about 12 minutes. Marcus is watching the access logs. Every query you run on that account flags to a secondary alert system that Damien doesn't know about." Another pause. "Which means you have 12 minutes to decide whether you want to hear what I have to say before he gets there and tells you his version." Her brain ran the calculation. If Marcus was monitoring her queries, then Kane already knew the exact scope of what she'd found, which meant this call was not exploratory. He was not trying to find out what she knew. He already knew. This call was something else. This call was a pitch. "Talk," she said. "The account with Damien's signature," Kane said. "He set it up 26 months ago, before any of the subsidiary withdrawals began. He needed a collection structure that was completely separate from his main operational accounts, one that couldn't be reached through standard forensic analysis of his known financial network. He set up an account to steal from himself. He set up an account to receive proceeds from an operation he was running parallel to his legitimate syndicate business. An operation I didn't know about until 14 months ago, when I found the account by accident while auditing a Cayman correspondent bank that processes some of our legitimate transactions." His voice remained steady and almost gentle. "When I found it, I understood that I had spent 11 years building an organization for a man who was simultaneously running a secondary structure that I was not part of and not informed of. I had been, Ms. Vance, used, for a very long time, by someone I trusted completely." The ventilation system hummed. She listened to it. "So what you've been doing for 22 months, she said slowly, is stealing back. Recovering, Kane said. Recovering a portion of what 11 years of my work produced, from an account that Damien was keeping hidden from his own organization." A beat. "The subsidiaries I used belonged to the larger structure I built. I redirected a fraction of their output. Not toward myself, Ms. Vance, toward a separate fund. A fund I have been building as insurance." "Insurance against what?" "Against the moment Damien decided I'd outlived my usefulness." His voice, for the first time, had an edge underneath the calm, which is a moment that has arrived as of approximately 3 days ago, when he brought you in. She sat with that. She sat with the specific, uncomfortable possibility that what Kane was telling her was not entirely a lie, that the account existed, that the signature was real, that the parallel structure was Damien's, and that the theft was Kane's response to a betrayal rather than its cause. She also sat with the fact that Victor Kane was a man who had spent 11 years building financial structures specifically designed to be believed. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I want you to look at the account more carefully than you have so far. Specifically, I want you to look at where the money in that account has been going, not where it came from, where it went." A pause. "Because I think you'll find it went to people who are going to be very interested in why Damien Castell has a hidden account in the Cayman Islands, and very motivated to pursue that interest in ways that will be significant for everyone involved." She pulled up the account on the monitor. She went to the disbursements. She had looked at the inflows. She had not yet looked at where the collected funds had gone because she had stopped at the signatures, stopped at the shock of the name, and picked up the phone. She looked at the disbursements now. The money had gone to 6 destinations. 2 were Cayman holding companies she didn't recognize. 1 was a Swiss account. 1 was a domestic account in Dallas. And 2 were accounts she recognized immediately because she had been looking at them for 3 days. They were accounts in Victor Kane's network. She looked at the screen for a long moment. "The money in Damien's account," she said. "It's funding your operation. It's funding a structure I built using Damien's hidden capital as the seed investment. Everything I've redirected from the subsidiaries over 22 months represents a return on that initial investment." His voice was precise now, technical, the voice of the man who had built all of this. Damien's hidden account is the origin of the entire network. He built the machine, Ms. Vance. I just learned to operate it. Or, she said, and her voice was very quiet, you forged his signature on the registration documents, seeded the account with a small initial deposit to make it look like his, and built a narrative that points to him if anyone ever traces the structure back far enough. The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. "You're good," Kane said, and the warmth in his voice had changed quality slightly, still controlled, but with something underneath it now, something that recognized an equal across a distance and was recalibrating. "You're significantly better than Damien told me when he described you." "Damien described me to you? Before he brought you in? He asked my assessment of the Verimark audit, whether the analyst who'd flagged the pattern was a genuine threat or a coincidence." A pause. "I told him it was probably a coincidence. I told him the analyst was likely competent, but not exceptional. I told him to monitor the situation, but not act on it." Another pause, more deliberate. "I was wrong. And here we are. Here we were." Marisol looked at the clock. 7 minutes since Kane had said 12. If the timeline was accurate, she had 7 minutes before Damien arrived. If the timeline was accurate. "What do you actually want?" she said. "Specifically. Not the story about the account. What do you want from this conversation?" "I want the documentation you've built over the last 3 days. His voice was direct now, the warmth stripped back to something more functional. "All of it. The transaction analysis, the source files, the audit trail. Everything you've produced in that office. And in exchange, you walk out of this building tonight with the complete record of Damien Castell's hidden Cayman account and everything I can tell you about how it was structured and why. Which, in the hands of the right people, is leverage significant enough to make whatever Ethan Mercer's exposure looks like entirely irrelevant." Bom sikis satimam next. He let that sit. "Your ex-husband walks away clean. His name disappears from every document in this structure, and you have information that ensures Damien Castell never comes looking for you." She felt the shape of what he was offering. She felt the specific, targeted intelligence of it. He had identified exactly what she valued most and placed it on the table. Ethan's safety. Her own. An exit from a situation that had become something she'd never agreed to enter. She also felt, underneath that recognition, something harder and colder and more her own than anything Kane was offering. "No," she said. A beat. "Ms. Vance." No. Her voice was steady. "You're offering me safety in exchange for becoming your instrument. Everything I've built gets used for your purposes instead of Damien's. I exit one handler and walk directly into another." She looked at the monitors. "I didn't come into this building to work for anyone's agenda. I came because the work was interesting. And the work is still interesting. And the most interesting thing in it right now is figuring out which of you is lying and proving it with evidence rather than taking either of your words for anything." The silence was longer this time. "He will not protect you," Kane said. The warmth was gone completely. "When this becomes a situation that requires Damien to choose between his organization and your safety, he will choose his organization. He has done it before. I have watched him do it. It is the only consistent thing about him." "Maybe," Marisol said. "That's a risk I'll manage myself." She hung up. She had the encrypted drive in her hand before the call had been over for 10 seconds. She plugged it in. She began compressing and transferring the full documentation package. Everything she'd built, every source file, every analytical output, the Cayman account records, the signature comparison, all of it. It would take 4 minutes to transfer. She watched the progress bar and listened for the elevator, and thought with the white, pressurized clarity of a person who had just made an irreversible choice and was not second-guessing it. The elevator opened at 3 minutes 40 seconds. Damien came through the door and looked at the screen. He saw the transfer in progress. He looked at her. Victor called you, he said. Yes. What did he say? He told me the Cayman account is yours, that he built his operation using your hidden capital as the seed investment, that the theft was his recovery of proceeds you owed him. She kept her eyes on his. He also told me that Marcus is Carla's nephew and has been flagging my queries to a secondary alert system you don't know about. Something moved through Damien's face, fast, barely visible, but real. Marcus. That's what he said. Damien turned. Marcus was in the doorway. He had come up behind Damien, quiet as always, his broad frame filling the frame. His face doing that watchful stillness that Marisol now understood had never been professional discretion. It had been monitoring. Marcus, Damien said. His voice was very quiet. Marcus said nothing for a moment, then, Mr. Castell. His voice was flat, professional to the end. I want you to know I didn't tell him anything about her work. I only flagged the access patterns. That was the arrangement. The arrangement with Victor. With my aunt, and through her, yes. A pause. I didn't know what he was going to do with it. But you flagged it. Yes. The word sat in the room. Damien looked at Marcus for a long time with the cold architectural anger she had learned to recognize in him, and Marcus looked back without visible expression, and the moment between them was the specific kind of moment that happened when someone decided whether what came next was a conversation or something else. Get out of this building, Damien said, quietly, completely. Don't come back. Marcus left. His footsteps were as quiet going out as they had been coming in. Damien turned back to Marisol. He looked at the transfer bar, which was at 91%. He looked at the encrypted drive. He looked at her. The account? He said. The Cayman account with your signature. I found it at 417. She held his gaze. I need you to tell me right now whether that signature is real. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the compression of feeling, not the controlled presentation of a man managing his image. Something more fundamental than that. The look of a man deciding whether to trust someone with a thing that could destroy him. It's real, he said. The transfer hit 100%. She pulled the drive and held it. Sit down, she said. He sat. For the second time since she'd known him, Damien Castell sat across from her in a chair at the same level, but this time it wasn't his choice. Start from the beginning, she said. The real beginning. Not the version where you're the victim of an inside job. The actual origin of that account, why it exists, and what it has to do with the money Victor has been moving. He looked at her hands, at the encrypted drive between them on the desk. If I tell you this, he said, you become part of it. I became part of it the night you pulled up to a bus stop in the sleet. Her voice was not raised. It did not need to be. Tell me, he told her. It took 20 minutes. She did not interrupt. She listened the way she listened to everything, without editorializing, without flinching, building the structure as it was presented, filing each component against what she already knew, identifying the places where his account fit the evidence and the places where it required her to accept his word without corroboration. The Cayman account was real. He had set it up 26 months ago as a quarantine structure, a place to hold capital that was being moved out of his main operations in preparation for a significant structural change he had been planning for 18 months. He was in the process, quietly, of legitimate conversion, taking his organization's financial networks and rebuilding them, layer by layer, into something that could operate within regulatory frameworks. The Cayman account was a transition fund. The money in it was not stolen. It was his. Victor had found it 14 months ago. And Victor, rather than confronting Damien, had made a different calculation. He had used knowledge of the account as the blueprint for his own parallel operation, building a theft structure that mirrored Damien's legitimate quarantine structure closely enough that, if anyone ever traced Victor's network, Damien's account would appear to be the source and the model. Victor had not been stealing back. He had been preemptively building a frame, and it had almost worked. He needed you to find the account, Damien said. His voice was tired in a way she hadn't heard before. He needed someone good enough to trace the full network, and then to find the Cayman structure at the end of it, and to conclude, correctly, given the evidence as presented, that I was the architect of my own theft. With that conclusion documented by an independent forensic analyst, he had everything he needed to make me the story. And you needed me to find it first, Marisol said slowly, before he could control what I did with it. Yes. You could have told me about the account when you gave me access to the records. If I had told you about the account, you would have evaluated everything through that frame. I needed you to find it the same way Victor needed you to find it, independently, following the evidence, arriving at the conclusion the evidence pointed to. I needed to know that your conclusion was the genuine analytical output of your methodology and not a product of what I'd told you to look for. She looked at him. You needed to know whether I'd believe you, she said. I needed to know whether the evidence laid out correctly would support the accurate version of events. Not my version. The version that's actually true. He held her gaze. I've been running this organization for 17 years. I know the difference between a man who can be trusted and a man who performs trustworthiness. I did not know 3 days ago which one you were. I know now. The office was quiet. Outside the windows, Houston was beginning its pre-dawn shift. The darkness not lifting yet, but thinning slightly. The city's noise patterns changing from the 3 a.m. variety to the 4:30 variety in ways that were subtle and consistent. Victor is going to move, Marisol said. He knows I have the full documentation. He knows Marcus is burned. He knows Carla is burned. He has nothing left inside this organization, and he knows it. Yes. He'll go to whoever he was planning to go to with the framed version. Regulatory contacts, law enforcement relationships, media. He'll present whatever version of the evidence he has access to and try to initiate something before we can counter it. He has 48 hours at most before his own asset movements become visible to people he doesn't control, Damien said. After that, his credibility as a source becomes compromised by his own exposure. He looked at the drive in her hand, which means we have less than 48 hours to present a complete, accurate, independently verified account of what actually happened to the people who need to see it. Who are the people who need to see it? Damien was quiet for a moment. There's a federal organized crime financial task force that has been building a case against my organization for 3 years. I have been in quiet, unofficial communication with that task force for 14 months. The transition I told you about, the legitimate conversion, that process involves their cooperation. He paused. What they don't yet have is the documentation of Victor's operation. If they receive it, correctly framed, from an independent forensic analyst whose methodology is unimpeachable, it becomes the evidentiary foundation of a case against Victor Kane, not against me. Marisol looked at the encrypted drive. She thought about what she was holding. 3 days of work. The most sophisticated financial analysis she had ever produced. Evidence that pointed, depending entirely on how it was framed and presented, and what supplementary documentation accompanied it, either at Damien Castell or at Victor Kane. She thought about framing. She thought about sequence. She thought about the order in which evidence was presented, determining whether a person understood it as a conclusion or merely as data. She thought about what she was being asked to do, which was not simply find the truth. She had found the truth. She was being asked to construct the presentation of it, to build the argument, to sequence the evidence, to produce the document that would determine, in a federal proceeding, which man this story was about. She thought about standing at a bus stop in the sleet with 12% battery and nowhere to go. She thought about Ethan's name on a registration document she hadn't built and couldn't have stopped. She thought about what it meant to be good at something in a world that had spent a significant amount of energy trying to convince her she wasn't. I'll do it, she said, but I need 3 things. Damien waited. Ethan's name is removed from every document in Victor's structure before anything is submitted. Completely. I don't care how it's done. I don't want to know the mechanics, but his name does not appear in any filing. Agreed. The task force gets the complete documentation. Not a curated version. Not the version that makes you look cleanest. Everything I found, including the Cayman account and your signature, with your explanation attached and supported by whatever corroborating evidence you have for the legitimate conversion. She held his gaze. If they're going to cooperate with you, they need the actual picture. He held her gaze. Agreed. And when this is over, she stopped. Started again. Victor Kane used Ethan as a pawn. He built a frame around someone who had no idea it was happening and no capacity to defend himself from it. I want Ethan to know that. Not for me. Not in a way that connects to any of this. But I want him to know, at some point, what was done in his proximity and who it was done by. Because I spent 7 years married to a man who made me feel insufficient, and it turns out he spent the same 7 years being someone else's convenient fool, and there's something in that that I need accounted for, even if I can never explain why. The office was very still. Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "That I can arrange." She nodded. She looked at the drive. She looked at the monitors. She looked at the window where the sky was doing its very early, very tentative movement towards something other than dark. "I need a secure workspace," she said. "Better than this. And I need access to your documentation of the conversion process, everything you've produced in 14 months of communication with the task force. And I need coffee. A lot of it." Damien stood. "The 41st floor has a conference room I don't use. It has better screens and a direct secure line to our legal team." He was already moving toward the door. "I'll have someone bring coffee." "Not Marcus," she said. "Not Marcus," he agreed. She pulled the drive and her notes and followed him to the elevator. In the elevator, going up, she stood on one side and he stood on the other, and neither of them spoke. The city outside the glass shaft was enormous and indifferent and burning with its customary conviction. She looked at it and felt the particular quality of a person who has made a decision that cannot be unmade, a decision that changed not just what came next, but what everything before it had been building toward, and she breathed through it, and she did not look away. The doors opened on 41. She stepped out. Her phone, the personal one, 4 days into a new charging cycle, buzzed once on her hip. She looked at it. It was a news alert from the Houston Business Chronicle, time-stamped 4:58 a.m. Breaking. Federal agents execute search warrant at Ardent Capital offices. Senior VP Ethan Mercer among those questioned. Sources indicate financial fraud investigation. She stared at the screen. Victor Kane had not waited 48 hours. He had moved tonight while she was on the phone with him, while she was building her documentation, while Damien was telling her the real version of events. He had moved simultaneously, submitting whatever he had to whoever he had, setting the frame in motion before she could counter it, knowing she was running against the clock and choosing to. She read the alert twice, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, because the brain, when it received information that was simultaneously expected and catastrophic, needed to run it twice before it accepted the information as real and not as the product of 4:58 in the morning cognitive deterioration. Ethan Mercer among those questioned. The words sat in her chest with the specific weight of a thing she had failed to prevent, not from love, not anymore, but from the simpler and more durable obligation of basic human decency towards someone who had not known what was being built around him. She looked up from the phone. Damien was already on his. He had seen it, or someone had called him. Either way, he was standing 6 feet away with the phone at his ear and his face doing the compressed, cold thing she now knew was not composure, but rather the deliberate suppression of a response that, released, would have been significant. "I need the task force contact," she said. "Right now, tonight, not in 48 hours. He held up one finger, still on the call. She watched him listen, watched his jaw tighten once and release. He lowered the phone. Victor submitted a partial evidentiary package to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division at 4:31 this morning. He submitted it through a former federal prosecutor he's maintained a relationship with for 6 years. The package includes transaction records from the subsidiary network, the Gray Line employment files, and a summary document attributing the architecture of the entire operation to Ethan Mercer, acting as a front for my organization. Mas sobishwem ochendes. He paused. The summary document does not mention Victor Kane. Of course it doesn't. She was already moving toward the conference room. How partial is the package? It's missing the collection account, the Cayman structure. He followed her. He didn't include his own fingerprints, because he needs the Cayman account to be found independently by the investigation, not submitted by him. If the investigators find it themselves, it looks like discovery. If he submits it, it looks like misdirection. She pushed into the conference room and went straight to the main terminal. He's smart. He submitted enough to start the investigation and left the most incriminating piece for the investigators to find on their own, in the sequence he's arranged for them to find it, which leads them to the account with my signature. Which, without your explanation and the corroborating documentation of the conversion process, reads exactly the way he needs it to read. She pulled up the terminal. I need a secure uplink to whoever you've been talking to at the task force, right now, before the FBI's Financial Crimes Division gets 20 feet deeper into that package. Marisol. He said her name quietly, and she stopped typing and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of the conference room with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled presentation, not the compressed anger, not the patient authority of a man who was accustomed to having more time than his opponents. Something more exposed than any of those. If we submit to the task force tonight, there is no controlling what comes after. The conversion process becomes official. Everything about my organization's history becomes part of a federal record. It becomes real in a way that it currently isn't. He held her gaze. I need you to understand what you're pushing us toward. I understand what I'm pushing us toward, she said. Do you understand what Victor has already pushed Ethan toward tonight while we were standing here? He was quiet. The man is being questioned by federal agents right now, she said, for something he didn't do that was built around him by someone in your organization, using your organizational history as the material. Her voice was not raised. It was something more controlled than raised, and therefore more pointed. I'm not pushing you toward anything you didn't agree to 14 months ago when you started talking to that task force. I'm pushing you toward doing it tonight instead of at a schedule that's now been made irrelevant by Victor Kane. She turned back to the terminal. Give me the contact. He gave her the contact. The call happened at 5:22 in the morning. It lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Marisol spoke for most of it, presenting the documentation in the sequence she had designed, walking the task force's forensic team through the analytical methodology, answering questions that were technical and precise, and delivered by people on the other end who were good at their jobs and were now engaged with something that was clearly better constructed than what they had received from Victor's submission 4 hours earlier. Damien spoke for 22 minutes of the 4 hours. He spoke about the Cayman account, the conversion process, the 14 months of communication with the task force's leadership. He spoke with the precise, unembellished directness of a man who had decided to stop managing the distance between himself and a consequence, and was now walking toward it at his own pace, on his own terms. She listened to him do it and filed it alongside everything else she had filed about him over the past 4 days. The bus stop, the coffee, the 11 minutes, the way he said her name when what followed mattered. At 9:43 in the morning, the task force's senior director told them to stand by and put them on hold for 18 minutes. When she came back, she said that a coordinated response was being prepared and that the documentation Marisol had submitted was being independently verified by their own forensic team against the records already in federal custody. She said that Ethan Mercer had been released from questioning at 8:15 and that his legal status was, at this point in the investigation, not the primary focus. Marisol closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them and kept working. Victor Kane was arrested at 11:57 in the morning. She did not learn this immediately. She learned it at 2 in the afternoon when Damien came into the conference room where she had been working continuously for 9 hours and set a cup of coffee on the desk beside her without announcing himself and said quietly, "It's done." She looked up. "He was taken at his home," Damien said. "Coordinated warrant. The task force, the FBI Financial Crimes Division, and 2 additional agencies I was not previously aware were involved in the investigation." He sat down in the chair across from her. He sat the way he had sat across from her in the 39th floor office. Same level, deliberate, chosen. The Cayman account is frozen. His external assets are frozen. The former federal prosecutor who submitted his package this morning has been contacted by his own former colleagues. He picked up his own coffee. Victor Kane has no remaining operational capacity. Marisol looked at her hands. They were tired. Her hands were tired in the specific, deep way that hands got when they had been moving precisely for too long. The tendons tight, the fingers slightly stiff, the joints aware of themselves in a way they usually weren't. "Carla," she said, "referred to the relevant regulatory bodies 3 hours ago. She won't face criminal charges if she cooperates with the investigation, which her attorney has already indicated she will." He paused. "She's not a violent person. She's a person who made a choice for the wrong reasons and compounded it. That's common." "Marcus?" "Gone." I meant what I said. A pause. He flagged access logs. He didn't submit evidence or participate in the construction of the frame. His culpability is real, but it's limited. He'll have to live with what limited means in practice, which is its own consequence. She nodded. Ethan, she said. Damien set his cup down. His name has been removed from the Ardent Capital documentation submitted to federal custody. The task force is aware that his connection to the structure was manufactured. He will receive, in the near future, a quiet communication from the Ardent Capital legal team indicating that his position is being restructured, essentially that his employment is being terminated due to the company's legal situation, with a settlement package that is specific enough to suggest someone wanted him out without noise. He won't understand why. No, but he'll be clean, legally, professionally, entirely. He held her gaze. You asked for that. I said I'd arrange it. It's arranged. She nodded again. Outside the conference room windows, Houston was doing its afternoon thing. The sun at its aggressive Gulf Coast angle, the skyline hard-edged and indifferent, the freeway interchange trailing its constant procession of vehicles, going from one place to another with the conviction that the place they were going mattered. She had looked at that skyline from this building for 4 days now, and it had looked different each time, not because the skyline had changed, but because the person looking at it had. She thought about the third thing she had asked for, Ethan knowing at some point what had been done in his proximity. She looked at Damien. The third thing, she said. He met her eyes. Ethan Mercer received an anonymous document package at his home address at approximately 10 o'clock this morning. The package contains a summary, not the full investigation documents, not anything that connects to you or to this organization, of Victor Kane's use of his employment history as a structural element in a financial fraud. It explains, in plain language, that his Ardent Capital promotion was engineered by Kane as part of a deliberate setup. It names Kane. It explains what was done. It does not explain by whom the document was prepared or delivered. She was quiet for a moment. How did you have time to arrange that? I had it prepared 48 hours ago, when I understood where this was going. A pause. It was a contingency. I wasn't certain I'd use it. What made you certain? He looked at her steadily. You asked me to. She turned back to the window. She sat with that for a moment. Sat with the specific, not entirely comfortable feeling of having asked for something and received it. Not as a gift, not as a transaction, but as the natural consequence of having been heard by someone who had listened with the specific quality of attention that she had spent 7 years being unable to locate in her own home. What happens now, she said, to your organization? The conversion. The process continues. With the task force's formal cooperation rather than informal communication, which accelerates certain components and complicates others. He turned his coffee cup slightly on the desk. A small movement. Several things I have been operating will need to be restructured or discontinued. There will be a period of significant adjustment. And your people, the ones who aren't Victor and Carla, most of them will make the adjustment. Some of them won't. The ones who won't will leave. He looked at the cup, then up at her. I've known for some time that this transition would cost me things I'd built. That's what transitions cost. You sound like you've made peace with it. I've made a decision about it, he said. Peace is something else. Peace takes longer. She understood that. She understood it with the part of her that was still processing, somewhere beneath the 9 hours of sustained forensic work and the 4-day compression of an entire life rearrangement, what had happened to her own constructed version of things. The 7 years, the Sunday weigh-ins, the dinners she'd stopped going to. The way she'd learned to make herself smaller by such gradual degrees that she hadn't noticed, until she was standing at a bus stop in the sleet, that she had nearly disappeared. She had not disappeared. She was, in fact, sitting in a 41st floor conference room, having just spent 9 hours producing the most significant forensic work of her career, under conditions that would have destroyed most people's ability to think, and the work was good. She knew it was good the way she knew when analysis was accurate, not from external confirmation, but from the internal clarity of a methodology that had been applied honestly to evidence that had been gathered carefully. The work was good, and it was hers. I want to renegotiate my contract, she said. Damien looked at her. The terms you offered in the SUV were appropriate for a woman you'd just pulled off a bus stop who had nowhere to go and no leverage, she said. That's not the current situation. She held his gaze. I want a formal role with defined scope, defined authority, and compensation that reflects what I've actually demonstrated I can do. I want it in writing, reviewed by a lawyer who is not yours. She paused. And I want it to reflect the legitimate version of this organization, going forward, not the other version. A silence settled. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of two people who were looking at each other across a desk and recognizing with the specific clarity that came from having been through something that burned away the unnecessary that they were not going to perform a version of this moment for anyone's benefit. Those are reasonable terms, Damien said. I know they are. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Small. Not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the acknowledgement of a smile before the full commitment to it. I'll have the legal team prepare a draft. Your legal team or a neutral party? A neutral party, he said, with the same precursor expression. Obviously, she nodded. She turned back to the terminal and began the process of organizing and archiving the final documentation. Clean copies, source files, the complete analytical record of 4 days that had started at a bus stop and ended with the collapse of a 22-month criminal construction. She worked for another hour. Damien stayed in the room, on his phone, managing the downstream consequences of a morning that had been, by any measure, extraordinary. They did not speak much. They didn't need to. The room had the quality of a space occupied by two people who had been through something together, and were now separately processing the aftermath with the other person's presence as a baseline rather than an intrusion. At 4 p.m, she stopped. Not because the work was unfinished. The work was finished. She stopped because her body had been awake for 32 hours and was beginning to present its case for rest with increasing insistence, and because there was a limit, even for her, to what precision could be maintained past a certain threshold of physical depletion. She saved everything. She closed the terminal. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the window. 3 weeks passed. They passed the way weeks passed after significant events. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a texture that was different from ordinary time, more granular somehow, each day more individually distinct than the days that had preceded the event. She was aware of herself moving through those 3 weeks in a way she had not been aware of herself in the years prior. Aware of her own decisions, aware of her own appetite for the work, which had not diminished but had changed quality. It was no longer the appetite of someone proving something, which was what it had been for most of her professional life. The constant low-level need to demonstrate competence to an audience that had never asked for the demonstration. It was simply the appetite of someone who liked the work. The contract was signed on a Thursday. The neutral lawyer, a woman Marisol had found independently, who specialized in financial sector employment agreements and had no prior relationship with Damien or his organization, reviewed 3 drafts before Marisol was satisfied with the language. The compensation figure was 40% higher than the initial offer from the SUV. The scope of authority was broader. The legitimacy clause, as she had privately named it, occupied half a page and was specific enough to be enforceable and general enough to accommodate the organizational changes that were still in process. She signed it with the pen the lawyer offered her and felt the specific gravity of a signature, the way a name on a document changed the relationship between a person and a situation from theoretical to actual. Victor Kane's legal proceedings moved at the pace that federal proceedings moved, which was measured in months rather than days. She was deposed twice. The depositions were long and technical, and she answered every question with the same careful precision she brought to her analysis. The analytical methodology described step by step the evidence chain documented from origin to conclusion. The distinction between what the data showed and what she had inferred from it maintained with the rigor of someone who understood that the difference between those two things was, in a legal proceeding, everything. The task force's senior director called her after the second deposition to tell her that the evidentiary foundation she had produced was, in the director's assessment, the most methodologically rigorous independent forensic analysis her team had encountered in 11 years of financial crime work. She said it without particular warmth. It was a professional assessment delivered in the tone of a professional assessment. But it landed in Marisol's chest, with a weight that was disproportionate to the brevity of the sentence. She said thank you. She meant it. Ethan called her once. She had not expected the call, and she did not know until she saw his name on her personal phone. The old contact entry, still there, which said E. Mercer, and had been there for 9 years through 2 phone upgrades because deleting it had seemed at various times either unnecessary or like a declaration she wasn't ready to make. She did not know until she saw it whether she would answer. She answered. He said her name with the specific uncertainty of someone who had not been certain she would pick up. She could hear it, the half-breath before her name, the slight drop in pitch that meant he'd prepared for the call to go to voicemail and was now reorienting to a live conversation. Ethan, she said. A pause. I got a package, he said. A few weeks ago, someone sent me a document about Victor Kane, about Ardent Capital. Another pause. About what he did. I heard about that, she said carefully. Did you? He stopped. Were you involved in any of this? She thought about the honest answer. She thought about what the honest answer contained and what it would cost him to receive it, and what it would cost her to give it, and what either of those costs was worth, measured against the simpler and more durable value of a conversation that was real rather than managed. I was working a forensic case, she said. I found things. Some of those things involved your situation. I made sure that what I found was used accurately. She paused. That's as specific as I can be. The silence on his end was the silence of a man processing a version of events that was, for the first time, scaled correctly. Not himself at the center of it, not the story he'd told himself about his own ascent, but a picture in which he had been peripheral, used, a prop in someone else's architecture. I'm sorry, he said finally. Not for the Ardent Capital thing. The word carried more history than that. She could hear it, the weight under it, all the Sunday mornings, all the careful cruelties that hadn't announced themselves as cruelties, all the years of incremental diminishment that he might or might not have the self-awareness to fully account for, but that he was, in this moment, gesturing toward with the limited vocabulary available to a man who was not accustomed to apology. She sat with it. I know, she said. She did not say it was fine. It was not fine. She did not say she forgave him, because forgiveness was not something she'd arrived at yet, and she was not going to perform it for his comfort. She said, I know, because she did know. She knew that he meant it, in the partial, imperfect way that people meant things, when they were looking at their own behavior from the outside for the first time and finding it smaller than they'd thought. And she knew also that the meaning of it did not retroactively repair anything. Meaning was not repair. Meaning was just meaning. Take care of yourself, she said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand and the old contact entry on the screen, and then she went into her contacts and changed the name from E. Mercer to Ethan, and put the phone down and did not think about it again that day. The steakhouse dinner happened on a Thursday evening in late November, 6 weeks after Victor's arrest. It was not planned as a confrontation. It was planned as a business dinner. Damien's organization hosting a group of Houston commercial real estate executives as part of the ongoing, quiet, methodical process of building legitimate relationships in legitimate industries. The reservation was under a corporate name. The guest list was business. The venue was the kind of place that required reservations 6 weeks in advance and had a wine list that occupied its own bound volume. She hadn't been planning to attend. It was Damien's dinner, his meeting, his landscape to navigate. She was a forensic analyst, not a socialite, and her presence at a business dinner for commercial real estate executives served no obvious function. Damien had mentioned it once, 2 days before, in the way he mentioned things, direct, unelaborated, leaving the decision structurally open while being personally clear about his preference. She had said she'd think about it. She had thought about it and decided to go, and she had not examined that decision too carefully because she understood that some decisions were better left unexamined. She wore a dress she had bought herself, with her own money, in a store she had chosen based entirely on her own taste. It was a deep burgundy that she would not have worn 7 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 2 years ago, because Ethan had a way of suggesting, without ever stating directly, that strong colors on her were a mistake, too much somehow, too insistent, drawing attention she hadn't earned. She wore it anyway. She had been wearing strong colors for 3 weeks. It was a small rebellion, but it was hers. She arrived at the restaurant at 7:45, 15 minutes after the dinner had started. She had timed this. Walking into a room that was already assembled was a choice she was making deliberately. Not to make an entrance, but to walk in as herself rather than as someone who had been waiting. The room was full. 60, 70 people in the main dining area, the kind of crowd that generated its own low roar of conversation and the particular warm light of a space designed to make its occupants feel consequential. She was shown to the table and she walked through the room, and she was aware of herself doing it. Not the anxious awareness of someone counting the looks, but the cleaner awareness of a person who had recently recalibrated her relationship with the space she occupied. She occupied space now. She did it without apology and without announcement. Damien saw her before she reached the table. She watched him register her arrival. Not dramatically, not with the overt attention that would have made it performative, but with the small specific adjustment of a man whose baseline changed when a particular thing entered the room. He stood as she approached, which he did not do for anyone else at the table, and the people around him noticed this and recalibrated their assessment of who she was accordingly. She sat down. He introduced her to the people at the table with her full name and her title, Chief Forensic Analyst, which was what the contract said, which she had not softened into something more modest because the title was accurate, and accuracy was the thing she had decided to stop apologizing for. The dinner proceeded. She ate. She talked about things that were interesting. There were people at the table who knew things she didn't know, and she asked them about those things with the direct curiosity that she had once suppressed as aggressive and now recognized simply as herself. She drank one glass of wine and switched to water. She did not perform. She did not manage herself for anyone's comfort. At 9:30, while the table was moving toward dessert and the conversation had fragmented into smaller side discussions, the man 2 seats down from Damien said her name with a slight frown that preceded a question. A real question, she could tell from the frown, not the social pretense of one. He was asking about a financial analysis technique she'd mentioned 20 minutes earlier in a different part of the conversation, and he wanted to understand it, and she explained it. And while she was explaining it, she felt Damien beside her. Not touching her, not intervening, just present in the specific way of someone who was listening not to what was being said, but to the quality of the person saying it. The dinner ended at 10:15. The guests dispersed into the Houston night. The restaurant returned to its ambient condition of wealth and low conversation. Marisol stood at the table while the last exchange of business cards was completed around her. And when the table had cleared, she and Damien were left with the wreckage of dinner for 12 and the comfortable quiet that occupied the room when it no longer had to perform. "Good evening," he said. It was the first thing he had said to her directly since she'd arrived. "Not bad," she said. He almost smiled. That precursor expression again. She had cataloged it over 6 weeks and understood it now as the closest thing he regularly allowed himself to open feeling. Not suppression, but an honest upper limit. The natural ceiling of a man who had spent decades making his interior life nobody else's business. They walked out together. The November air in Houston was cool rather than cold. Nothing like the sleet of 6 weeks ago, just the honest autumn temperature of a city that didn't commit fully to winter until it had to. The valets were bringing cars. The street was illuminated by the restaurant's exterior lighting and the general ambient glow of a city that never fully turned itself off. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the city and thought about the bus stop on Meridian and 49th, the aluminum walls, the cracked plastic roof, the trash bag at her feet, the 12% battery. The version of herself who had stood there and cataloged the situation without editorializing and arrived at the conclusion that it was bad but not unsurvivable. She had been right. It had not been unsurvivable. But that version of herself, the one who had survived the bus stop through sheer methodological stubbornness, who had gotten into the SUV because the alternative was standing still and freezing, that version felt like a long time ago. Not because the qualities were gone, because they'd been joined by things that the bus stop version hadn't had access to yet. The knowledge of what she could do when she was given the material to work with, the knowledge of what she looked like in a burgundy dress in a room full of consequential people, the knowledge that the thing she had spent 7 years being told was too much, was in fact the exact right size for the life she was apparently now building. "I want to ask you something," she said. Damien, beside her, turned slightly. "The night at the bus stop," she said. "You said you had precise timing." She looked at him. "Did you know that bringing me into this would lead where it led?" the task force, the conversion going formal, all of it. He considered this. She watched him consider it, not the performance of consideration, but the real kind. The kind where a person was actually interrogating their own retrospective account against what they could honestly verify. I knew it was possible, he said. I didn't know it was certain. There's a difference. And if it had gone differently, if I'd taken Victor's offer when he called, or if I'd decided the Cayman account was enough to walk away from, then it would have gone differently. He looked at the street. I don't build plans that depend on other people doing the thing I need them to do. I build plans with room for the person to be themselves. He paused. You were yourself. It went this way. She looked at the street too. That's either very wise or very convenient, she said. Most wise things are convenient for someone, he said. That doesn't make them less wise. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. They looked at the street. The valet brought his car. He didn't move immediately toward it. I'll see you in the morning, he said. Not a question, not a demand. The statement of a man who expected her presence in the space they both now occupied and found that expectation neither surprising nor requiring elaboration. Yes, she said. He walked to the car. She watched him go. He did not look back, which was consistent with everything she had come to understand about the way he moved through the world. Forward, without the backward glance that announced itself as sentiment and was usually more self-performance than feeling. He got in. The car moved. She stood on the sidewalk alone for another 2 minutes. The Houston air was cool and carried the smell of the city. Exhaust and concrete, and somewhere the suggestion of rain that was not going to arrive tonight but was building somewhere to the west for a later date. She stood in it and breathed it and felt the specific, undramatic quality of a moment that was not a climax and not a resolution, but simply the authentic texture of a life that was actually being lived. She had arrived in Damien Castell's world with nothing she'd chosen to bring. A trash bag, a dying phone, a forensic mind that nobody had asked for, and a body that had spent years being evaluated by someone else's standards and found lacking. She was leaving that version behind, not tonight specifically. Tonight she was standing on a sidewalk in a burgundy dress, watching a city she had always lived in look subtly different from the way it had looked before. The leaving happened the way all real leaving happened. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions about what you were willing to carry forward and what you were choosing, finally, to put down. She put down the weight of 7 years. She put down the Sunday mornings, the notebook in the desk drawer, the dinners she'd stopped attending, the version of herself that had learned to take up less space and had nearly, by the end, taken up none at all. She kept everything else. Her hands, her methodology, her appetite for the thing that didn't fit the pattern, the number that broke the sequence, the thread that pulled, the burgundy dress, the contract on her own terms, the knowledge, not confidence, which was something you performed, but knowledge, which was something you earned, that the capacity she'd always had was exactly as significant as she'd always suspected, and had simply been waiting for a situation large enough to contain it. The valet asked if she needed her car. Yes, she said. She drove home through the city. The lights were everywhere, as they always were, burning with their customary indifference. She had looked at those lights from the 39th floor and the 41st floor, and through the windows of an armored SUV and from a bus stop in the sleet, and they had looked different every time, and they looked different now. Not warmer, not more welcoming. The city was not a welcoming entity, and she had no illusions about that. But navigable. Known. A landscape she was moving through on her own terms, in a car she'd chosen, toward an apartment she had selected herself, in the life she was in the ongoing process of building out of the materials the last 6 weeks had provided. She drove. The city burned around her. She let it.